Доброго дня, друзі!
Good afternoon, friends. A briefing on refuting the fakes of Russian propaganda and their intention to create the illusion of support for the actions of the occupiers in the territories of Ukraine that are now under their control. So here we go. Russian propagandists spread fake news that Ukraine refused to use the Geneva Convention for the treatment of prisoners of war. Thus, the classic Russian propagandist Solovyov on his social networks reported this. According to him, it was as if Ukraine had informed the British Foreign Office of its intention to refuse the Geneva Convention in its treatment of Russian prisoners of war. The Ukrainian leadership has brought it to the attention of the British Foreign Office that it doesn't intend to comply with the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, and that captured Russian soldiers are not supposed to be given sufficient food and emergency medical care under the pretext that many Ukrainians are now being deprived of this. Contrary to the fact that the war brought a lot of grief to the Ukrainian land, Ukraine doesn't and has never refused to apply to the Geneva Convention in the treatment of prisoners of war. The official position of the Ukrainian state, voiced, for example, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is that the statements of Russian propagandists are lies. This lie is intended to discredit the relationship between Ukraine and the international humanitarian structures that rescue victims of Russian aggression and help return deportees and prisoners of war home. Moreover, this is not the first time that a fake is spread by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. It was the original source of this story. Let me remind you that the head of this Foreign Intelligence Service, Mr. Naryshkin, became famous when he could barely answer Putin's question during a meeting of the Russian Security Council as to whether he supported the proclamation of pseudo-sovereignty of temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in Luhansk and Donetsk regions. After that, to rehabilitate himself, he was forced to become the source of these fakes of Russian propaganda. Before, they had already created fakes about, allegedly, thousands of Ukrainians seeking asylum in Russia. Of course, this is also fake. This is a humanitarian disaster created by Russia. They tried to save Ukrainians by moving them to the territory of the country that created that humanitarian disaster. This is Russia itself. They also spread fakes about the inhuman treatment of Russian prisoners of war, about metallurgical combine Azov-style workers asking to join the ranks of the Russian invading army, etc. Another appeal is not to believe Russian propaganda and its fakes. Meanwhile, they are already trying to create the illusion of support for their invading actions not only in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, but also in the recently occupied Ukrainian cities. Thus, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, next week the occupiers want to organize a pseudo-referendum in the town of Tokmak in the Zaporizhia region, where they will allegedly create support for the decision to occupy this town by the aggressor country. In particular, the occupation administration has already notified the local population about this event. Meanwhile, in the recently occupied Melitopol, they are also trying to get the support of the local population, in particular among educational institutions. They demand to conduct the educational process in April 2022 in Russian language, and those educators who agree to teach in Russian are promised a monetary reward. They want to bribe and gain the loyalty of local elites, because educators are the elite of our society. In addition, the occupiers continue the attempts to distribute the so-called humanitarian aid, the need for which arose because of the humanitarian catastrophe which the Russians themselves created. At the same time, they are appropriating Ukrainian humanitarian aid coming from the city of Zaporizhia. In Stanitsa Luhanska, the occupiers are carrying out propaganda activities. In particular, employees of the occupation administration work with the low-income families that are registered within social services, and they are also given so-called humanitarian aid. A classic example of cynicism and propaganda. First, they created a humanitarian catastrophe, but now they seem to be helping to solve it by distributing humanitarian aid, which is often stolen from the shelves of Ukrainian stores. Meanwhile, in addition to the already mentioned fakes, another storyline launched by the Russians a few weeks ago about the alleged image of the victim in which Russians are to appear in the eyes of European countries continues to play. I will briefly remind you of the fake allegations that Ukrainians set fire to the Lomonosov school in Berlin, or about the crucified boy in the suburbs of Bonn, the first capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. Now a fake in Berlin. It is alleged that Ukrainians committed acts of vandalism at the World War II memorial in Treptov Park. A monument to the Soviet tank was covered with the Ukrainian flag. Such actions cannot be called vandalism, as Ukraine was one of the nations that suffered the most from Nazi aggression. They also painted the monuments in Treptov Park. Such propaganda is deliberately made in order to discredit Ukraine in the German capital, where large-scale actions in support of Ukraine are regularly held almost every weekend. Such actions take place in the central squares of the city, including near the Brandenburg Gate. I urge you to do the same thing as always. Do not trust these propaganda tricks because they have the same origin. They are Russian fakes. While Russian propagandists play out the traditional line of antisemitism for Russians on Ukrainian soil, this time it plays out in a different storyline about the alleged cooperation of Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian Jews. The Federation of Russian Jews Communities has issued a statement alleging that a gathering of nationalists was taking place in a synagogue in Uman, where weapons were being collected. Russia's Jewish community has called on religious leaders to raise the issue of the inviolability of religious buildings during the war, according to Russian propagandists, including nightingales on the social networks. It is worth recalling that Russian propagandists have no logic. They report on extreme nationalists and antisemitic views in Ukraine, and then report on the cooperation of Jews and nationalists in Uman. They need to update their methodology a bit because they constantly contradict each other. This concludes the briefing, urging viewers from Ukraine and the international community to watch the briefings in translation to maintain critical thinking, distrust Russian propagandists, and trust the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian political leadership. And everything will be fine. Glory to Ukraine.